Hey guys, welcome back to another vlog. Have you ever been to a casino meetup game before? Would you believe me if I told you I hadn't? Well, that's about to change. Come on. So, it's episode 16, and, as some of you might have put it together by looking at the video title, we're at the Hustler Casino for a meetup game with the one and only Phil Hellmuth. That's right, the poker brat. Now, the short of it is, Phil was at the event, but somehow he never made it over to our table, and that means we never got to mix it up with Mr. Positivity. Nevertheless, we still had a good time, and even got a copy of his signed autobiography. So, that's sort of cool, right? Anyhow, like I said earlier, I had a ton of fun meeting some of you at the meetup. We sat down at a table with a bunch of cool people, and there was plenty of action to be had. So, let's get into some hands and see where the story goes. We start out by buying in for the table max of 1,000, and before we get ourselves fully situated, we find ourselves in the middle of our very first hand. The pre-flop action folds to the cutoff, who raises to 20, and action folds to me in the big blind, where we look down at ace-5 of hearts. Folding is out of the question, so we have our first real decision whether to raise or call. I typically like to get my bearings before swinging for the fences, and little did I know that this specific opponent would show a propensity to attack my blinds later on. So we opt for a call, and see a flop of 8-8-9 with 2 hearts. All things considering, one could say that this is a really good flop, as we have an over along with a flush draw. We check it over to our opponent, and on the off chance that they decide to toss out a continuation bet here, I think it would present a pretty neat check raise opportunity. However, things don't escalate to that level when this opponent checks this one back. The turn brings a 10 of spades, and on the surface, this card should really connect with our perceived range in the big blind much more than it does our opponent. Now, while this card might look scary, if our opponent had 2 overs and a backdoor gutty, we would expect them to bet the flop a large portion of the time. Yeah, so for all the aforementioned reasons, we toss in a bet of 25 to take over the betting lead, and not too surprisingly, we end up with a quick fold. Now, I'm going to preface this next hand by saying that it definitely was not played correctly, but in the end, it's in the vlog because we're not cherry-picking hands, and more importantly, it's sometimes interesting to watch self-inflicted debauchery. About an orbit in, we're playing 5-handed and get dealt ace-king suited, first to act into hijack. We open to 20, and the cutoff and big blind both call. We're 3 ways to the flop of 10-8-3 with 2 spades. Against one opponent, this is probably a good spot to put out a continuation bet. But against 2, it's a bit more questionable. As played, we check this over once it's over to us, and action checks around. The turn pairs to 8, followed by another round of checking. The river brings the 7 of hearts, and just as action looks like it's about to check through, the big blind decides to bet out 40 here, and I decide that this bet just doesn't make a ton of sense for several reasons. What is he really value betting here? A 10? Maybe, but not this guy. A 7 when the straight gets there? Anyhow, without getting too wrapped up in overthinking a hand, I end up making a call here, and get shown the good old Queen 3 offsuit. Yep, that's my problem for sure. I ignored the fact that this opponent had Queen 3 offsuit in their range. Just kidding guys, it was a questionable call at best, so let's just move on. In this next hand, we find ace-jack under the gun, and raise to 20. Action folds all the way to the blinds, and both the small and big blind make the call. 3 ways to the flop, and we see ace-10-3 with 2 hearts. This is a pretty good flop, everything considered. Both blinds check the action over to me, and I continue here for 25. The small blind finds a call, while the big blind checks out. The turn brings the 5 of hearts, which completes the front door flush draw. When the small blind checks this over again, I think it's pretty close between either checking or betting since we have the jack of hearts, but this time, we check this one back for some pot control. The river is the 8 of spades, which is a pretty static card, and shouldn't complete too many 2-pair draws. When the small blind checks again, we're fairly certain that we have the best of it and opt on a bet sizing of $30 to target weaker aces and possibly some hands containing a 10. After a rather long tank, the opponent calls and we show our hand and it's good. Based off of initial profiling and the long tank, I think we got pretty close to max value for this hand. You know, I'll tell you that I'm not a huge fan of limping in LA games, just because of the drop structure here, where the house takes out $7 on the flop in most locations. I think this applies to Hustler as well, but I'm not entirely sure. If you frequent the Hustler and know what the drop structure is, please drop a comment below this video, and I'll pin the answer as I think it might be helpful for the community at large. In this following hand, we have a mid-position and button limper. Since I'm in the small blind with 9-7 offsuit, there's not a whole lot to do except for to check my option. The big blind checks as well. We're 4 ways to a flop of 7-7-6. It's always an awesome feeling to flop trips, but in this spot there's not a whole lot to do except to check. The big blind also checks, and when action gets to the mid-position player, he tosses out a bet of 15, which gets called by the button and myself. The big blind ends up checking out. If things couldn't get any better, we make a house on the turn when the 9 of spades appears. The action this time checks all the way to the button, who bets out for 20. At this point, we happily check raise this to 60 to get some additional value and to build a pot in case anyone calls here. Unfortunately, we do not get any interested parties as both the mid-position player and button find a fold. Now, this next hand is a bit of a punt. Not necessarily because I disliked the way I played it. It was just a bad run out, and I had to abort plans on the river. You'll see what I mean in a moment. We're back to playing 6-handed, and for this one we're on the button with 10-9 of clubs. When action folds to me, I open to 20, and just the big blind ends up calling. The flop is 8-3 deuce with 2 hearts, and when it's checked over to me, I bet 45, and our opponent in the big blind calls. The turn brings the 4 of spades, which might pair up the opponent if he was open-ended, but this doesn't deter us from betting 85 here. This time, we get a super quick call from the big blind. We were still planning to blast off on the river until the 8 of spades shows up. The big blind checks, and now we actually go into a short tank for about 20 seconds here to think about our options. Riverboard pairs, especially top pair, are pretty bad for my original plan of blasting off here to win the pot with sheer aggression. If the opponent has an 8, he's never folding. And if he has a 4 in case of having 5-4 for an open-ender on the flop, he's likely not folding either, even to an all-in, as he's relatively short. For all those reasons, we wave the white flag and give up. The opponent shows ace-4 offsuit for a pair of 4s. We weren't too far off from our initial guesses after all. One of the other players at the table adds some table banter by saying, "Good call, I like it," and "The table's heated, we're ready now." Whenever you hear this at the table, it might be a sign that others perceive you to be under tilt for whatever reason, and at the very least, plant the seed in other people's mind that you just might be, even if you're not. This next hand happens immediately after hand 5, and while I can't be 100% sure, I felt like the table banter preceding this hand comes into play here. A mid-position player who has been pretty active at the table raises to 20. This was the same opponent that we were involved with in the first hand of this vlog. Action folds to me in the cutoff, and we call with King-Jack offsuit. Heads up, we see a flop of Jack-10-3, and the opponent continues here for 40. This is a deviation to his normal betting pattern, and we're cognizant of what's going on here when we opt a flat call here and see a turn. The 4 on the turn brings in a backdoor flush draw. The opponent now decides to check it over to us, and we're planning to step on the gas here, capitalizing on the perception that I might be steaming. We bid out for a 105 and get a quick, "I don't believe you" kind of call. He didn't actually say it, but it was fairly evident from the body language. The river pairs the bottom card. Action checks over to me again, and this time I'm thinking about going for some decent value. An overbet might be okay here, but I opted for more of a 60% size bet of 200 to ensure a higher chance of getting a call. The opponent calls pretty quickly, and we're good, so who knows, maybe an overbet here would have been more appropriate. About another orbit or so goes by, and we pick up pocket aces in mid-position. I open to 20, and the cutoff, button, small blind, and big blind all call. I wanted some action, but at this point, we might as well call this a bomb pot. 5 ways, we see a flop of queen 6-3 with 2 clubs. Action is checked over to me, and I continue here for 40. The cutoff, button, and small blind call. The 4 of hearts peels on the turn, which freezes action as it gets checked around. The river is the 7 of hearts, which is pretty ugly as it now puts a one-liner on the board. At this point, I'm not feeling so great about my aces anymore. Surprisingly though, action checks all the way through. The small blind shows a pair of queens, but our aces are still best here, and we drag in one of the last pots of the day. We end up racking up, saying our goodbyes to the table, and heading over to the cashier. So, how did we do today? We were in for 1,000 and out for 1454 over a period of roughly 2 hours. Not too shabby if you ask me, only if they all went this way. I'm thinking about putting out some footage from a mix of a few 5-10 sessions at Commerce, and while it's not cohesive enough to make a vlog, I'm thinking of making a quick fire session where we just cover hands if there's enough interest. Leave a comment below and let me know if that sounds interesting to you. If we get at least 5 interested comments, we'll make it happen. Lastly, I encourage you to like and subscribe to this channel if you think I've earned it. It is always appreciated and will help this community grow. Thanks again for joining me on another poker vlog. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and see you next time.